All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Again, welcome everyone. My name is Brian Silva. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the Vice President of Outreach and Engagement at Americans United for Separation of Church and State. And I'm also the coordinator of our Summit for Religious Freedom, or SURF, which will be coming up in April, and of which this webinar is part of a series we'll talk about in a moment. First things first, for those requiring ASL interpretation, Zoom has a new feature. So along the bottom of your screen where it says things like Q&A, you should have a symbol that looks like a globe. It says interpretation. And when you click on it, you can choose to turn on American Sign Language, or you can choose to turn it off. You still should have a box that says CC to turn on closed captioning. If you don't see any of those, there should be a more button that you can click and it might show up in there. If you have any issues, feel free to use the chat. We can help with some of the troubleshooting there. So again, a new ASL interpretation with Zoom, there's a globe icon on the bottom you can click and then turn on American Sign Language. Closed captioning also still along the bottom for those who have joined us before. We'll be taking questions. So if you do have a question at any point, feel free to use the Q&A feature, again, also written along the bottom. You can put questions into there. We'll answer those during, as well as saving a large chunk of time at the end. And as a reminder, this is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to all registrants of the webinar. So again, this webinar is part of our continuous conference, SURF, the Summit for Religious Freedom, which is being held April 22nd through 24th in Washington, D.C. and online. It is the hub for our collective fight for religious freedom, church-state separation, and the issues that depend on them, like LGBTQ rights, abortion access, protecting public schools, democracy, and more. Virtual events like these webinars ensure the learning, conversation, and networking at SURF continue year-round. We call this continuous programming SURF 365. So in the future, SURF 365 virtual events like these will only be available to Summit attendees, but we're excited to make them available to everyone this first year. And as a bonus, all registrants of this webinar will receive an email tomorrow, like I said, with a link to the recording, and a limited time discount code to get tickets to join us at SURF in Washington, D.C. A little bit about the organizations and the panelists joining us tonight. Americans United for Separation of Church and State is the only organization dedicated solely to defending the separation of church and state. We are the shield protecting the foundational American principle of freedom of religion, including the right to believe or not believe for all. Also, PRRI, the Public Religion Research Institute, is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to conducting independent research at the intersection of culture, religion, and public policy. And now I would like to introduce our panelists who will be joining us this evening. First, Robbie Jones is the president and founder of PRRI. He's also the author of White Too Long, End of White Christian America, and the upcoming The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy. And you'll see in just a moment in the chat a link to his page on Amazon to check it out and hopefully purchase any of those books I mentioned. He also has a fantastic Substack that you can subscribe to, and we'll also be putting that in the chat as well. Rachel Lazar is the president and CEO of Americans United for Separation of Church and State, and one of the foremost authorities on the topics we're discussing tonight. And finally, Andrew L. Seidel, Vice President of Strategic Communications, also at Americans United, and the author of another amazing recent book, American Crusade and the Founding Myth. And we'll put the chat link to his books as well. So Rachel, Robbie, Andrew, thanks for joining. I'll sign off. Take it away.
Great. Yes. Thanks, Brian. And hi, everyone. It's incredible to be with such a wonderful crowd tonight, talking about a very unfortunately timely topic. I wanted to welcome the many people who are on with us already, who will be, I'm sure, joining us throughout this webinar. Welcome those especially who are members of Americans United. Welcome those who've already bought their tickets for SURF, as Brian calls it, the Summit for Religious Freedom, which will take place in Washington in April. And there will also be an online component. And I really wanted to welcome Robbie Jones, who is a phenomenal longtime friend and colleague. Robbie and I often tell the story of how I have worked for him and he has worked for me over our many years together. And I just wanted to say about you, Robbie, that you are able to find this incredible way of coming into a void, in my view, which is, that space of the overlap of politics and policy and religion. And you do it so deftly. I feel like you also do it in a way, and I'll just use a very modern way of talking about it, which we've debated over the word, but that uses your privilege to do good in the world. And I really appreciate that about you. And also, you come from a background, not everyone knows, maybe you do though, because you've read White Too Long, one of Robbie's incredible books. But Robbie comes from a background of being evangelical Christian and going to church 5 times a week and the whole thing. So he really brings an intimate knowledge of what we're dealing with and also a love for everybody. So I'm just super excited that you have done this deep, deep dive into this topic of Christian nationalism, white Christian nationalism. We'll talk about that distinction. The group that you founded, PRRI, does this American Values Survey every year. And I really have always told people who talk to me that you should join PRRI. You should follow Robbie Jones on Substack. I mean, this is really valuable information. Robbie, we're so happy and lucky to have you with us tonight and appreciate you giving us and all of us your time. And I wanted to turn it over to you so that you could give us an overview of this fascinating new wealth of data and survey that you've conducted with the Brookings Institute.
Well, thank you, Rachel. Such a gracious introduction, and I am thrilled to be here tonight. As you said, the topic is unfortunately pressing, but I think it's really important for us to spend some time talking about it. And I'm so happy to see so many people joining us here from the AU network and beyond. Greetings to everyone out there. Our time is going to go by very quickly, so I am going to just jump in and tell you a little bit about this new survey that PRRI conducted in partnership with the Brookings Institution. It's just been out a few weeks, so this is pretty much hot off the press. But we set out to really try to understand this term Christian nationalism, what it meant, and how big this movement might be and what kind of a threat it might pose, both really for American democracy and even American churches themselves. So without further ado, I'm going to just jump into some data. I'm going to share my screen here and jump right into the data. All right. All right, so this is a survey I said was just released a few weeks ago at the Brookings Institution. It's a very large survey. It's over 5,600 Americans. So that gives us a high degree of confidence in the findings. It's a representative survey of all Americans, and it was conducted in December and just released a few weeks ago. One of the main contributions that we made here was to try to figure out how to quantify what Christian nationalism is. There's been a lot of ink spilled in the media. We hear this term kind of bandied about, but we defined it using 5 different questions. As you can see, I won't read them all, but you can see they get at very similar things. So the U.S. government should declare America a Christian nation. U.S. laws should be based on the Bible. God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society. And we basically combined these 5 questions into a single composite scale, and then gave everyone in the survey a score that basically went 0 to 1. And essentially then we're able to divide people into how much they affirmed these basic tenets of this idea that the country is a Christian nation. And what we found essentially is this, and these terms are to the right are terms that we applied to these groupings once we looked at the patterns in the data. And essentially Christian nationalism adherents are those who strongly agreed really across the board with all 5 of those questions that you saw on the screen before. Sympathizers are those who essentially agreed with those questions, excuse me, but not entirely agreed. Skeptics, those who doubted that, but not rejected all of it. And then rejectors were actually those who rejected all 5 of those questions and strongly disagreed with him. Excuse me. So here's what it looks like in the country. So it's 10% of the country are adherents, 19% are sympathizers. So that's 29% of the country that basically lean toward Christian nationalism. But that means that 2 to 1 Americans largely reject this worldview. And it's only about 3 in 10 who lean toward supporting this. And so, well, what difference does it make? And before I get to the demographics of who these people are, just to give you a sense of a basic question and how it cuts across these categories, we had another question about what kind of a country people wanted to live in. And the 2 options were, I prefer the US to be a nation made up of people belonging to a wide variety of religions, or I would prefer the US to be a nation primarily made up of people who follow the Christian faith. Now, these numbers that you have up right now are where the country is. So it's about 3 to 1. People affirming, wanting to live in a religiously pluralistic country versus only about a quarter of the country who want to be primarily made up of people who follow the Christian faith. But check out what Christian nationalism adherents look like. They're essentially the mirror opposite of the country, right? So by a margin of 3 to 1, those who affirm strongly those 5 Christian nationalism sentiments overwhelmingly say that they prefer the US to be a nation primarily made up of people who follow the Christian faith. Those who are sympathizers, you can see very similarly, not as strongly, but again, majority on the side of wanting to live in a majority Christian country. And then when we get to the skeptics and rejectors, you can see a big movement away from that set of beliefs. So that's what a difference it makes on just a basic question of what kind of a country do people want to live in. So who are they, and particularly how do these sentiments cut across different religious groups? And one of the main things that we found here, and I'll just put up the first 2 categories here, those who are lean toward either sympathizers or adherents to Christian nationalism. And essentially you see right off the bat that there's no other group in the country that affirms the views of Christian nationalism more than white evangelical Protestants. The next group that is in majority territory is actually a very small group. It's other Protestants of color. It's a group that only makes up about 3% of Americans. It's primarily Asian American and Pacific Islanders who do tend to lean Republican and lean conservative. And then the other group I'll mention are Latino Protestants here, who share many of the theological views of white evangelical Protestants. They tend to be evangelical, identify as born again, and lean conservative in their makeup. And just so you can kind of get a sense of, there's the other side of skeptics and rejectors. You can see the religiously unaffiliated and Jewish Americans down here at the bottom, strongly more than 9 in 10, either skeptics or rejectors on the kind of complete opposite pole of white evangelicals here. One of the places I'll say is that sometimes people have kind of made the argument or hypothesized that people who adhere to Christian nationalism aren't really connected to churches. That is, that maybe they're Christian in name only. But we actually found the opposite of that. And this confirms a lot of other research for my book, White Too Long, and other research that PRRI has conducted. We essentially found a strong, positive, and in fact, linear relationship between attending religious services. So attending church makes one more likely to be a Christian nationalism adherent or sympathizer. In fact, those who attend religious services once a week or more, half of those folks are either Christian nationalism adherents or sympathizers. And you can see it goes down in a very linear fashion by frequency of religious attendance. Finally, I want to say something about party. So first I should say that this is a 501c3 nonpartisan webinar. PRRI is an AU or nonpartisan organizations, but the data does tell us something about our 2 political parties here. And so descriptively looking at this data, what we do see, and this is one of the reasons why, even though it's only about 3 in 10 Americans who are either adherents or sympathizers with Christian nationalism, why it has so much power and why it may actually threaten our democratic institutions. And that is because it has essentially become a majority view in one of our 2 political parties. So among Republicans, 54% actually are either a Christian nationalism adherents or sympathizers. It looks very different even from independents here and Democrats. And a term that political scientists use also just often to describe a pattern like this. We often hear about polarization, and yes, the country is polarized along partisan lines, but it's not evenly polarized. That is, independents aren't just in the middle. It really is Republicans who look further from the middle than Democrats do. So asymmetric polarization is really what we're looking at here, with independents and Democrats closer to each other and Republicans really somewhere quite different. The other thing we found in terms of demographics are that those who supported Christian nationalism in those top two categories, they tended to be older, over age 50. They tended to not have a four-year college degree. And notably, I think we'll loop back around to this, though, we did find very little differences by gender or by race or ethnicity. So though gender or race or ethnicity did not make one more or less likely to affirm those core tenets of Christian nationalism in the data. One other thing I'll say here, and then I'll pause here, is that it is the case, though, that white identity did make a significant difference even among those who are Christian nationalism adherents. So this slide builds on work that I did in White Too Long, where I looked at questions that were really about systemic racism and a denial of systemic racism, or an affirmation of so-called reverse discrimination and racial resentment. And on these scores, again, there's a kind of high correlation between adhering to Christian nationalism and essentially rejecting the idea that systemic racism exists, or that white supremacy is a problem in the country today. So these first two bars that I have up here show you the difference between all Americans, which is the top bar, and Christian nationalism adherents. And you can see on each of these questions, there are 30, nearly 40 percentage point difference between Americans and those who adhere to tenets of Christian nationalism. To take just the first one, those who adhere to Christian nationalism, are 25 points more likely to disagree that the history of slavery and discrimination have created conditions that make it difficult for many Black Americans to work their way out of the lower class. So just deny that those things of the past had any difference. One thing that we found here is that white identity really makes a difference even among Christian nationalists. So if I look at Christian nationalism adherents who are white, you basically see that, yes, they disagree, but they disagree by a good 10 points more here. And we see that kind of across all of these questions here, that white identity essentially makes disagreement with these statements even stronger. And if I put up here a Christian nationalism adherents of color, you can see it's a vast difference between Christian nationalism adherents who are white and those who are not. And that's really part of what I'm sure we'll talk about more. But the real threat before us is Christian nationalism, but it's also married up to white identity. So it really is an ethno-religious movement that's really white Christian nationalism that is the most dangerous form of this ideology, and that Christian nationalism itself can even mean something different to white Americans than it does to Americans of color. And I will stop there because I think we're going to come back to this term, but let me stop there and hand it back over to Rachel.
Hi, that was great. Thanks, Robbie. This data is so rich. I'm trying to contain myself from pointing to so many of the other things that I found so interesting in your survey. I just want to plug, I did write a column about it this month in Church and State, and we can include that in the email follow-up. But just the relationship also between Christian nationalists wanting to preserve Christian power and, of course, white power, but also what we saw was the correspondence to anti-immigrant views, anti-Semitic views, anti-Muslim views, and a patriarchal understanding of traditional gender roles. And I don't think that would surprise anyone, but I still had to say it. I also like the distinction that you drew between Christians and Christian nationalists. I know that at the Brookings event on the when you unveiled the survey results, that you talked about how Christian nationalists white evangelicals, I think, or maybe it was evangelical Christians, Robbie, are 5 times more likely than the rest of Christians to be Christian nationalists. Was that the right figure? And something like
yeah.
that?
Now, evangelical identity seems to be a real trigger here for leaning into this idea of, again, these ideas that the country is a Christian country. It was founded to be a Christian country, and it's very old. I mean, this is really this idea of manifest destiny and the idea that of a new Zion, right? It goes really actually before the country was even founded. We have these ideas percolating and competing with the idea of a pluralistic democracy, really from the beginning.
Yeah, and that it's just some Christians, because I know that like every day Americans United partners with Christians. We just brought a lawsuit in Missouri challenging their abortion ban on behalf of many Christian clergy. And I have pushback often from Christians, even when we use the label of Christian nationalism, who say, well, that's not really Christianity. And that's the point, it's Christian nationalism. But I also wanted to get into or ask you about one other very pertinent area of your survey to Americans United, which is the question that you included on church-state separation. And the reason that I wanted to raise this topic, and I realize that I'm preaching to a lot of the choir here, is because what we're fighting right now is a movement, an emboldened movement that is a minority that is attempting to codify their power and privilege into our law. So the bulwark against that is to keep religion and government separate. That's the way to stop them from achieving their end goal, right? So it's really important, and it's what our organization exists to do, which is to protect that foundational value that is protected by the first 16 words of our First Amendment of our Constitution. So what I wanted to ask you about, Robbie, is to share what you found in your poll and all of, the interesting findings about church-state separation.
Yeah, it's interesting and it's complex, as you and I have talked about. So we asked kind of a standard question that we've asked for a while. That's an agree, disagree question, and it reads, we must maintain a strict separation of church and state. So in the country, it's 79% of the country agrees with that statement. Only 20% of the country disagrees with that statement. But we were surprised to find that when we looked across these categories of and correlated to adherence to Christian nationalism, we did not exactly find the pattern fully that we thought we would find. So on the one hand, we were not surprised to find, for example, that those who fully reject Christian nationalism, that 93% of them agreed that we must maintain a separation of church and state. We were not surprised that the Christian nationalism skeptics, that 80% of them said that we must maintain a strict separation of church and state. But we were surprised to find that 63% of the Christian nationalism adherents also agreed that we must maintain a strict separation of church and state. So there's some differences there in the direction you would expect, but to find that we're still in 63% of even those who just told us in the same survey that the U.S. law should be based on the Bible and the U.S. should declare itself a Christian nation, still think that they're affirming a strict separation of church and state, or think that they affirm that principle.
Yeah, and we actually, when we did our own public opinion research in February of 2021, we actually found similar overlap, which I in part attribute to the intentional confusion that the religious extremists, the Christian nationalists, are creating around some of these essential terms like religious freedom and even church-state separation. But do you have other theories of the case of why that is, or what's going on?
Yeah, it's certainly curious, and I think that that's part of it. Is that this idea of separation of church and state. You can think from the right and the religious right perspective. One way of reading that is, yeah, we're going to keep government away from our religion, so religion can have free reign to kind of go everywhere it wants, right? But not the flip side, right? And so I think that part of the campaigns around religious liberty and that steady drumbeat and has muddied the waters in a way that the civics term that we all kind of learned in whatever 8th grade civics class or in high school, that people still think they're affirming that, right? Even as they actually reject the bedrock meaning of that term at the same time.
Yeah, no, and that's just calls out and screams and hollers for a national recommitment campaign to separate church and state, where we can re-educate the public about what church-state separation is really about and religious freedom is really about. We debated this, Brian, when we named the Summit for Religious Freedom. should we call it the Summit for Real Religious Freedom? No, we're calling it the Summit for Religious Freedom because that's what religious freedom is. And I'll just end this little section before I turn it over to Andrew and say something nice about him on this note, which is there's something really optimistic, though, about the fact that your poll still found 79% support, right, for strict separation of church and state. And when we did a poll back in February, so what is that, 10 months before, we found more like 66% of Americans support, which is still great. It's still a super majority and a plurality. And that's what you found in some of your old polls where you asked the same question. So we've seen a big jump. And sure, some of that is because of the mislabeling and these, ultra conservatives coming along in this bizarre way. But also we see these really high numbers of support for, those who are rejectors and who aren't sympathetic to Christian nationalism. And I think we're riding a high wave and we need to take full advantage of it. So now I just want to, before I turn it, go for it.
Just going to put an exclamation point on that, because I do think this is where we can kind of go back to that very first pie chart that I showed, right? That if you look at the people who, again, on these measures of what it actually means to have it, like for the country to be a Christian nation, right? That we should declare it a Christian nation. It really is Americans 2-to-1 reject that view, right? We should really remember that. It's only 29% of the country that leans that direction, right? The rest of the country leans away from it. So we really are talking about a very loud and organized minority of Americans. It's nowhere near even half, right? The country that affirms those views.
So we're ending on this little section on a positive note, which is great. And it's a perfect time for me to just say a few words about Andrew Seidel, who's right here as well on this call, who, recently-ish joined Americans United, but it was a real coup. And I think for our organization to attract someone like Andrew, he's written, as Brian referenced, 2 books about this topic. One, the more recent one, the American Crusade one, which is about the Supreme Court and, the big trouble that we're in with this court. And his first one, of course, is called The Founding Myth. And we'll include all these links in the email. So Andrew is a real scholar of Christian nationalism, wrote the report following the insurrection with the Baptist Joint Committee, where he was at the time, on the strong and very omnipresent white Christian nationalist movement at the insurrection. Just so great to have you as a colleague, Andrew, and wanted to turn it over to you to start sharing your thoughts.
Yeah, that was the big takeaway I had, Robbie, from the numbers. Was I was actually hopeful. There's some devastating and awful data in there, but overall the numbers had me hopeful. I've long said that Christian nationalists and white Christian nationalists are raging against the dying of their privilege, and they're watching their power and the deference they believe they are due decline, and they're desperate to get it back. And that's really why they're turning to things like the insurrection and to white Christian nationalism and to these so-called strongmen like Trump. But one of the things I was really fascinated by was the results about the perceptions of the term Christian nationalism. I think this is fascinating, and I think it's so important, especially given the previous waves of white Christian nationalism that our country has survived and beaten back historically, that you were talking about earlier, Manifest Destiny, all these older ones. And, I remember when the Founding Myth came out in 2019, the subtitle is Why Christian Nationalism is Un-American. And I had to do so much explaining about the subtitle and what Christian nationalism was. And now I think people know, and they are rightly afraid. And we've even seen how certain groups will try to co-opt phrases. During the election, Trump's supporters did it with deplorables, and this is like a pretty common historical tactic. I think Marjorie Taylor Greene tried to do it with Christian nationalism. She printed T-shirts, but it seems to me like they've failed. And they're writing books defending Christian nationalism that are very poorly written and even more poorly argued. But to me, the term seems to be like kryptonite. So I'm really curious as to what you found about how people perceive Christian nationalism.
Yeah, thanks. So let me just throw up another slide here. I'm kind of get us there. So in addition to asking people about, the underlying meaning of the term, where we could gauge their actual belief in the core tenets of this ideology, we actually just asked people about the term and whether they had a mostly favorable, mostly unfavorable view of the term. And here's what we found. Here is those who had a very favorable or mostly favorable view of the term. Again, you can see it's only about 1 in 5 Americans who hold a favorable view of the term. Interestingly, though, the people who had the most favorable view of it were the people who actually do believe its underlying meaning.
Mm-hmm.
So Christian nationalism adherents had the most favorable view of the term. But there's one little twist here, and that is that a lot of the public has not heard of the term still, right? So if you're, a political junkie or you're kind of inside the news bubble, you may find that hard to believe, as much ink has been spilled on the term, but in the media. But it's still nearly 4 in 10 Americans who have not heard of the term one way or the other. But notably, it's people who reject it who have heard of it more than people who affirm it here. And here's the kind of very unfavorable side of it. But I what we'll see, and we will be tracking these numbers on a quarterly basis between now and all the way through the election cycle. So stay tuned at PRRI for quarterly updates. We'll be able to kind of see whether people the favorability moves or whether adherence move, all of that as kind of the election cycle and those machines all get revved up. But in the state of play right now, this is kind of where we're at. I would say there's if we just fill these in proportionally, what we will see, I think, is adherence. It'll fall along ideological lines, but there is room here, I think, for maybe some more T-shirts to be printed. I'm not quite sure.
Well, I mean, and this is part of the reason that I took additional hope from this, was that it seems to be that as people learn about it, they are turned off by it, and they kind of move into the skeptic and rejector category. Yeah. Do you think that's fair?
We'll see. I mean, it's tricky, partially because the rejectors are more likely to be more socially engaged. They're more likely to have a 4-year college degree. So on the early side of a term like this coming into the public domain, they're more likely for it to just come across their radar screen. So I'm a little unsure about whether, once again, it gets into more general circulation, how that other 38% or so will play out.
Yeah. And now, Rachel, you mentioned the Baptist Joint Committee report that I wrote on January 6th. Robbie beat me to the punch on publishing on January 6th with an update for White Too Long. And I know you have a follow-up question on that, so go for it.
Yeah, exactly. And a follow-up question for Robbie from his poll, and then really for you to discuss too, Andrew, which is, you did write this report talking about the violence that we saw at the insurrection being largely attributable to white Christian nationalists. And Robbie, I'm wondering if you saw that. I know you asked about political violence. Well, I know that you saw that, but can you tell everyone what your poll showed about political support for political violence among Christian nationalists?
Yeah, let me go right back. Getting good at this. Yeah, so we asked a question, and we've been asking this question for a while about whether people basically support political violence. And the question reads, because things have gotten so far off track, true American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save our country. Again, if we look at this, it's only 16% of Americans that agree with this, so that we can all take some solace, I think, in that. But as you can see, the relationship between affirming the tenets of Christian nationalism and a tendency to political violence are positively and linearly correlated here. So that number rises from 16% of all Americans to 40% of those who are Christian nationalism adherents, saying, now that's a sizable piece of that group. If you really think about this question is asking, right, who think that we're in a kind of altered universe where the normal rules of morality, the normal rules of democracy don't apply here, and that we may have to actually pick up weapons to harm, kill, or maim our fellow citizens in order to save the country, right? That's what we're really talking about here. And it's 40% of that group that affirms these strong Christian nationalism tenets, that believes that might be the way that they need to go. And we certainly did see this on January 6th. I mean, I wrote a piece on January 7th for Religion News Service because I was so disturbed by what I saw. And probably one of the most disturbing things, in addition to seeing, a big wooden cross over here and a gallows over here on the steps of the Capitol. But one of the, I think, most disturbing things was to see the Confederate flag, being from Mississippi, something that I saw all the time growing up in public spaces. but the Confederate flag and the Christian flag, which is a white flag with a blue canton and a red Latin cross in the corner, which was the flag that I saw sitting up on the next to the pulpit. And many of you who grew up going to church probably saw that same flag. And to see that flag marched beside the Confederate flag in a violent insurrection at the Capitol, I think tells us, even though this is a minority of the country, it's something that we really do have to pay attention to and can't really turn a blind eye to. And I really am deeply grateful to AU and the work that you all are doing to kind of continue to draw attention to this. As I said, it's a kind of, a flow, a river, a stream that has flowed through our country's history, and it has always been a threat, to a pluralistic democracy. But I think in our day, and what you said, I think is exactly right. One of the reasons why we're seeing it rear its head again in our day is precisely because of the demographic change in this country. And in my one of my previous books called The End of White Christian America, what I charted there is exactly this, that the country really only in the last 20 years has gone from being a majority white Christian country, demographically speaking, to one that is no longer a majority white Christian country. And I think that realization sinking in has really set off this kind of very visceral reaction of kind of trying, and you'll hear all these words are like reclaim, restore, all of those kind of looking backwards to reclaim something that's lost, nostalgia kinds of words are really about trying to reclaim this, mythical past where white Christians felt they had ownership of the country.
Yeah, that's well said. And for me, watching the insurrection, it was seeing that Christian flag paraded on the floor of the Senate, and I remember seeing that live on MSNBC and recognizing that flag and my jaw just dropping, and then paying much closer attention to all of the other imagery and words that were there that day. And there was so much for the epilogue on January 6th to the founding myth that it ended up becoming this report with Baptist Joint Committee. I mean, there's so much there. And to me, the takeaway from these numbers, from your poll all the way back through January 6th to the idea that politicians can tap into this undercurrent that you're talking about, is that white Christian nationalism is a threat to every single person who is not a conservative, white, heteronormative Christian man. If you are not in that in-group, this movement is a threat to you. And that was one of the things that just kind of kept coming through for me when I was looking at these numbers.
I think Brian is telling us that
it's time for Q&A. Yeah,
we have a lot of questions, so let's start teeing them up, Brian. I think you're on mute.
Thank you. Yeah. So yeah, we've got a lot of questions. We'll do the best that we can to get to as many of these as we can. So thank you all very much. So the first is from one of our SURF registrants, Karaya. Do you think the increase in church-state separation support from your report to Rob's report is impacted by the Dobbs decision, the anti-LGBTQ bills, and other ways that the Supreme Court has been emboldening religious extremists?
That's a really interesting question. I think there is something of a reawakening happening. If you paid attention in the wake of the Dobbs decision, a lot of commentators were talking about the abortion fight and actually the Dobbs decision itself in terms of church-state separation. That there was quite a few op-eds that were published saying, well, I mean, this is an imposition of one narrow religious viewpoint on all of us. How can this stand in a country that has the separation of church and state? And that's what Americans United's lawsuit in Missouri is arguing. So I think people are starting to wake up to the fact that we're losing this founding American principle that we've kind of taken for granted for a while. But that is purely, and I hesitate to do this in the presence of two data experts, that is purely anecdotal. So
Robbie, do you want to?
Yeah, and add a couple of data points. We actually just released a big study actually of abortion attitudes in all 50 states, which is the first study. It was based on over 20,000 interviews that we did across last year. So you can actually see every single state in this report. It's on the PRRI homepage. at PRRI.org right now. But one of the things that we did find that post-ops, because we were in the field all year, we did see a bump in support for abortion rights. It's very, one of the kind of truisms in polling, if there ever was one, is that abortion attitudes have been so stable for decades. And so they just don't move until Dobbs. And so what they've been consistently, and it should be said too that the consistent number was somewhere in the high 50s is really where we would see support for legalized abortion. When we asked the kind of four-part question on whether abortion should be legal in all cases, legal in most cases, et cetera, those top two categories will always be 57, 58%. Our last report has it jumped to 64%, right? So we've seen very significant jump in support. The other point I would make here is that it has made a significant difference among Democrats' priorities as well, because when we asked about whether it's a voting issue, always historically, Republicans would say that it's a more important issue to them than Democrats would. And we're finally actually seeing Democrats actually slightly higher, saying that they would be reluctant to vote for a politician that did not, an elected official that did not share their view on abortion. And that's also very new post-Dobbs.
That is a shift, but I do want to say, and I saw from one of our, Bonnie Cleveland, I saw an activist put in the web chat too, that, on the ground though, people aren't necessarily sort of still connecting a lot of these attacks to white Christian nationalism or to attacks on church-state separation. And I think that's true. I mean, your poll found almost 40% don't know what it is, right? We found that in our poll, actually, from February 2021, a lot of our members are members because they know that abortion bans violate religious freedom, that attacks on LGBTQ people violate religious freedom. They largely come from a conservative religious community, et cetera, right? But a lot of Americans still aren't making that connection, which is why it's so important that we all get out there with our voices and make that connection in the different circles that we're in.
Yeah. Just one more quick point on this. It's worth noting too that white evangelical Protestants, who today, by the way, make up less than 14% of the population. Let me say that one more time. White evangelical Protestants that get all of this ink and are kind of at the heart of this movement make up less than 14% of the population today, and yet are driving so much of this view. And they're the only religious group, by the way, only major one that is strongly opposed to the legalization of abortion, right? So that's also worth noting. White Catholics, Latino Catholics support the legalization of abortion, for example.
So just a couple of quick data questions that folks had about the report, Robbie. Bob was asking if somebody identified as Muslim, were they allowed to choose the race they identified with? Because obviously, people of all religions come in different races, or was that ascribed?
Yeah, no, so everyone gets the same battery of questions. So they get a religious identity question, they get a race and ethnicity question, they get a race question, they get an ethnicity question. So everyone gets the same battery. But for Muslim Americans who make up around 1% of the population, we don't have enough to break them out separately in the poll by race. So that's why they're not broken out by race or ethnicity.
Okay, and then Mary asked if the survey asked about voting status.
We have voter registration. It's self-reported voter registration in the survey. So we do have self-reported voter registration. Yeah,
great. Janet, another one of the SURF attendees, said that folks who are unfamiliar with the term Christian nationalism are probably quite familiar, or maybe more familiar with white supremacy or white nationalism. How do you recommend we message around this when talking with others to help them understand the overlap? And I think this gets to what you've all been talking a little bit about, of there's still a large number of people where Christian nationalism is a new term, but they may be more familiar with some terms like that. So what are some suggestions around using terms that folks might be more familiar with to draw the connection to an understanding and more familiarity with Christian nationalism?
I can say one thing on this, which is in our poll, when we tested sort of the opposition, what we found is religious extremists polls at the top in terms of who people are opposed to. Now, again, It attracts some ultra conservatives for the wrong reason, but still there's an enormous gap between religious extremists and white Christian nationalists. Under white Christian nationalists, though, in our poll, Robbie, were Christian nationalists who people saw as more favorable than unfavorable. Let me repeat that. In our poll in February of 2021, of over 2,000 people, the respondents of the poll saw Christian nationalists more favorably than unfavorably. Now, that wasn't true when you added white to this point, Brian, in the question, but still my answer is we have a lot of educating to do. I mean, we have to explain ourselves. We just do. It's just not, I mean, adding white helps, but it's not fully the answer. We still have to explain what's going on. What do you, Robbie and Andrew, what do you two think? Anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think it shows up, the need to educate shows up in those big gray bars when we were talking about the perception of Christian nationalism, those gray bars right in the middle of people don't know. I mean, that was one of the things that jumped out at me. And I mean, to me, it is showing people that white Christian nationalism is bent on inequality and favoritism and privilege. And I mean that in the true sense, like Christian nationalism, white Christian nationalism seeks privilege in the true legal sense of that word. The conservative, white, heteronormative Christian men will be the in-group that the law protects, but doesn't bind. And everybody else, probably everybody watching this, all of us are going to be the out-group that the law binds, but doesn't protect. I mean, if you boil down the theme of, every dystopian novel, every authoritarian regime, that is the end goal, that the chosen few are protected by the law, which is just, perverted in that sense, and all others are bound but not protected. And this really is, I think, and has been the goal of white Christian nationalism, to codify or perhaps reclaim that white Christian privilege. And I think talking about it in those terms, that it is a threat to you unless you are part of that in-group. I have found that to be very, very effective, at least debating these issues on the front lines for sure.
The only thing I would add is, again, it's a new term in our generation. There's a great article actually in today's Religion News Service by Bob Smetana talking about the term Christian nationalism and its use in the early part of the 20th century, right? So it actually had a life in the early part of the 20th century. And again, what's going on in the early part of the 20th century? High levels of immigration, changing demographics, economic, depression. So those kinds of things, a lot of similar context going on. But to me, I think the thing to remember is whatever we're calling it, this impulse, right, is behind some of the oldest stuff in the country. So we're still fighting out. It's Manifest Destiny. It's a city set on a hill. It's the New Zion. It's the Promised Land for European Christians. Like, these are all very old and part of kind of American culture and DNA. And so, but all of those things, right, are anti-democratic, right? If we really think about an inclusive democracy that has everyone has an equal seat at the table, no matter what their race or religion. I mean, that is the kind of American ideal that's always been at odds with this idea of America as a new Christian promised land. And so I think we're still trying to choose, right? And struggling to kind of excise or exorcise, maybe is the better word, this other view from our democracy. And it's a real challenge. But I think also kind of taking it back to, are we committed to the basic principle that everyone sits in equal footing before the law in this country? Everyone gets a vote. If we're committed to that principle, we cannot simultaneously be a Christian nationalist, right? Those two things are fundamentally incompatible.
Exactly, which is why we saw them attempt to take down our democracy. And that's what's really at risk. Yeah.
So there's two questions that a lot of folks have asked in various ways. So I'm going to try to sum them up a little bit and answer a bunch of folks at the same time. Robbie, there was some questions very specifically about some of the demographics. And the three that keep popping up is, kind of what did we see as far as the difference based on age? A lot of it, like, is there hope with like middle-aged and younger people and the younger generations? Was it kind of, equal across? Another was, people of color. And then the third was there any parts of the country where Christian nationalism seemed to be, at higher rates? Some folks said they thought they knew, some folks wanted to know your answer. And so we're going to go with you and the data.
Yeah, so first of all, on age, yes, there is a kind of linear relationship there with older Americans being much more likely than younger Americans. And the break seems to be about age 50, right? So over 50, there is the likelihood of being a Christian nationalism sympathizer or adherent goes up significantly compared to younger Americans. One of the surprises in the poll, I think, was just purely on race and ethnicity. There were very little differences, particularly between Black and white. In fact, between Black and white Americans, there were no significant differences in likelihood of affirming those 5 key questions, right? But what we found, though, is that they mean different things in political space, right? So even if, for example, I'll go back to that slide where we had about anti-Black racism, for example. White Christian nationalism adherents are off the charts, right? 8 and 10. Denying that past discrimination has any effect on the present, denying that there's any inequality in our courts, denying that white supremacy is a problem, affirming that discrimination against whites is as big a problem as discrimination against other racial minorities in the country. Like 8 and 10, 7 and 10 is where white Christian nationalists are. The Christian nationalists of color are down in like the 40% range across all those questions. So it's a complex set of things that there are, a non-negligible minority of African Americans who affirm those 5 core tenets, but when you put them in political space, they don't draw the same conclusions about ownership of the country, denials of racism, anti-immigrant sentiment. Those kinds of things do not correlate in a way that they do for whites, right? So for whites, there's this whole other set of worldview that comes along for the ride that is disconnected for those people of color who affirm those Christian nationalism tenets.
Great, thank you. And then the next one that people asked, overwhelmingly, and I will just say we have almost 150 questions that have come in. We are answering them, both typing online and getting them to folks, and then here. So thank you all for this. I think it just shows, really just how much people really care about this. What can we do to push back, fight against Christian nationalism and for the ideals that we at our organizations believe and everybody on these calls so strongly believe in?
I can start, but want to hear from everyone for sure. We think there are sort of 4 things actually that we should be doing that can really help right now. The first is to connect the dots for people between church-state separation and so many issues that they care about, right? If you care about abortion and reproductive freedom, if you care about LGBTQ equality, if you care about thriving public schools, if you care about books not being censored, if you care about democracy, right, et cetera, if you care about racial justice, justice for the non-religious, religious minorities, then you should be opposing the surge of Christian nationalism and supporting, like your life and country depend on it, church-state separation. So connecting the dots can really help us broaden and diversify our movement, which we have to do. Number 2, we have to reach people in modern ways. And so we're trying to do that. AU is about to announce and launch a national recommitment to church-state separation campaign. That's super important. And we are really appreciative to our members for enabling us to get out on the wavelengths. We're going to actually be buying ads and doing a lot on social media. We have TikTok accounts now. I'm sure you all have enjoyed Andrew on those accounts. And, that's all really important for reaching people. We know that we also need to reach younger people, right? Because it's just not as understood or valued as it needs to be, given that it's one of the legs of the stool that the country is founded on and really like premised on. Without it, we fall, and the freedoms and equality that we value falls with it. So, we are running a youth organizing fellowship, expanding our youth essay contest, giving scholarships to our Summit for Religious Freedom to young people, and running a legal academy to fight back against what the Federalist Society is doing. So that's also really, really important. I think I'll actually stop at 3 and let others get in on this.
Robbie, you go ahead first.
Well, as a research organization, we're not an advocacy organization, but we do believe in democracy, and we are worried about the threats to democracy. So I think our job is to connect the dots, right, and to say yes. And I would say that the one thing we could do is to be clear about what we're talking about and not obfuscate. So it's not religious nationalism; it actually is Christian nationalism in this country. In other countries, right, it might be Hindu nationalism or other kinds of nationalism married up to a dominant religious force. But in this country, because of our history, because of the composition of our demographics, it really is Christian nationalism. And again, the most dangerous form of it is when that gets married to white identity. And what ends up happening really is that it is this claim of exclusive ownership of the country, right? And everyone else is sort of second class citizens, and that's a threat, I think, to our democracy. We should also recognize, of those of you who are on the call who are Christian, that this is a fundamental threat to Christian faith. At the end of the day, right? I mean, this is not, that vision of Christianity is hard to square with the Gospels, but we have done it over and over in American history, and I think the job of every generation, right, is to kind of put our shoulders to the wheel. And one last thing I'll say here is echoing Andrew, that I do think also why we're seeing it now is really because we are at this kind of moment where the kind of fever over reacting to demographic change is at a kind of high point. I do think the fever is going to break, but a lot of damage could be done in the meantime, right? So I think now is the urgent time to really get involved and to really protect our democratic institutions.
Yeah, I'll go real fast because I know we were going to start wrapping up here, Brian. But I mean, I'll say I think there's also a flip side to the argument of, the wishy-washy religious nationalism. I also think don't waste your arguments trying to differentiate between the various strains of this is Seven Mountain Dominionism or the Dominionism or New Apostolic or Lance Wallnau's school or Tim LaHaye's school or the Tony Perkins school of Christian nationalism. That stuff doesn't matter. Call it white Christian nationalism. Those things are really fascinating and they're fun rabbit holes to go down. And I can do that with some of you when you come to the Summit for Religious Freedom. I'd be happy to do that. But this is an existential threat to our country, so call it that. And the other two things that you really can do, to be blunt, are one, give money to AU. We are on the front lines fighting white Christian nationalism. We need all the help we can get right now. And the second thing is, if you want to know more about this and want to know more about what you can do, sign up to come to SURF. Sign up to come to the Summit for Religious Freedom. This is going to be a through line at the summit, and you don't have to be in DC to attend. We do have virtual options. Go to the SURF, THESRF.org, and sign up. I mean, these really are the best things that you can do to help join the fight right now.
And Robbie, while we're doing some of those plugs, can you just let folks know what PRRI's website is, where they can find more information about the great work you do, and you personally, and any other like social plugs you'd like to give?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. So all the data that we're talking about today, full report, full questionnaire, you can go all data geek on yourself if you want to kind of download that stuff, is on the PRRI.org. Homepage, and then I'm writing every other week or so on Substack at robertpjones.substack.com. New book coming out in right after Labor Day, September 5th, on the hidden roots of white supremacy and the path to a new American future. That's it. Thank you.
Great. So we want to do some final thoughts because we know we've talked about everything here. I know that'll take us a few minutes past the 1,500 people who registered. I think are fine with saying an extra minute or two. So Robbie, Rachel, and Andrew want to give each of you a chance to do a last minute thought or share if you would like to.
Yeah, I can go first. we can beat Christian nationalism. We can relegate it back to that fringe from whence it came. I think that means, as Robbie said, calling out white Christian nationalism whenever you see it rear its ugly anti-democratic head. That means fighting the disinformation and the historical myths that are bred by this exclusionary ideology, the claim that we were founded as a Christian nation, the idea that church-state separation only protects churches from government interference, that wall of separation is somehow a one-way wall. And above all, it means a national recommitment to the separation of church and state.
All right, I'll leave you the last word, Rachel. I just want to use this time to say thank you for this platform. Thank you for the work that AU is doing. It's really important. And thank you all for attending. And I will plug Andrew's books as well. I am an early reader anytime anything hits the new bookshelf from Andrew, and would encourage you all to do likewise.
Other than my extreme gratitude to Robbie and Andrew and Brian and David and Chelsea on the back end for our shop, and all of you for joining us tonight, I would just echo Andrew's enthusiasm and say we are on the winning side of history. There is no doubt. And just hearken you back to the data in Robbie's poll, right? Over 70% of Americans celebrate religious pluralism, right? And we're talking about fewer than 14%, right, of Americans who identify as, is it white evangelical Christian today?
Yeah, white evangelical Protestant, yeah.
Right, and again, and not all, and even not all white evangelical Protestants, even though there is a major trend going on, but Robbie, you and I have done that data too, that not all even are in this category of Christian nationalists. So we are on the winning side. We have to believe in the power of our voices. That's how we're going to make a difference. And it starts with calls like this. So thanks for joining us. I very much hope that you'll join us for the Summit for Religious Freedom at thesrf.org.
Yep.
Yes. Okay, Brian, back to you.
Great. So again, thanks everyone so much for joining. This is the website for the summit. Again, SURF is a continuous year-round summit. You have the SURF event in person in DC, which you can also attend virtually. And then that's followed throughout the year with webinars and virtual events like this, SURF 365, which at this point are available to everyone, but will become available just to those who register for SURF. Again, we offer scholarships both to attend in person as well as to attend virtually. And we will do everything in our power to make sure that anyone that wants to attend SURF, at least virtually, is able to attend, making sure that economics are not a barrier for anyone to participate. So if you're having any trouble, please apply for a scholarship on the website. And we're excited in the next week or two, we'll be announcing some of our keynote speakers, our breakout sessions, and you'll get even more complete piece of the program. Please follow us, Americans United, at Americans United on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. And if you feel so moved with the work that you see that we're doing, please consider donating at au.org. Please continue to support the great work of Robbie and the folks at PRRI. And with that, thank you everyone for a wonderful evening. Take care. Hope to see you at SURF in April.
Thanks.